A clumsy accident at a restaurant, a familiar pendant, and a shocking realization of the billionaire. Why was she shocked? Who is the female employee that shocked the billionaire like that? Please watch to see how the story develops. This gripping, emotional journey is brought to you by Voices of the Underdog. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support more powerful narratives. Vivian Caldwell sat in the back seat of her sleek black Rolls-Royce, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as she gazed out the tinted window. Chicago, the city of her past, the city of her deepest regret. Outside, the skyline rose in a blend of old and new, towering structures casting long shadows over the streets below. She had been back to this city countless times over the years, business meetings, charity events, high-profile gatherings, but it never felt like home. It never could, because Chicago was where she lost Emily. Her hands instinctively tightened in her lap. 20 years. It had been 20 long years since she had last held her daughter's tiny hand, felt her warm embrace, and heard her laughter ringing in the air. 20 years since the day she disappeared. The memory was burned into her mind, each detail crystal clear. It had been a bright afternoon, the kind of day that begged for a walk in the park. Emily had been 5 years old, her dark curls bouncing as she ran ahead, giggling as she chased after the pigeons near the fountain. "Mommy, look," Emily had called, her tiny hands waving excitedly. Vivian had smiled, her heart full as she watched her daughter's joy. She had only turned away for a second, just 1 second, to check her phone, and when she looked back, Emily was gone. That moment had shattered her world. She had screamed her daughter's name, searched frantically, begged strangers for help. But Emily had vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. Despite her power, wealth, and endless resources, nothing had led her back to her daughter. The best detectives in the country had combed through every possible lead. Posters were plastered across the city. A $2 million reward had been offered for any information, but there had been nothing. No ransom call, no trace, just emptiness. Over the years, the pain had not lessened. It had only buried itself deeper, weaving into the fabric of her soul. She had forced herself to keep moving forward, to build her empire, to become a name that no one could ignore. Caldwell Industries had flourished. Her wealth had multiplied beyond measure. But none of it had mattered, because Emily was gone. A soft buzz from her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. She blinked and turned toward Marcus, her assistant, who sat across from her, his sharp eyes scanning his tablet. "How much longer until we reach the hotel?" she asked, her voice steady but detached. Marcus glanced up. "Traffic's bad. It'll be another 30 minutes at least. Do you want to stop for something to eat? You haven't eaten since this morning." Vivian barely spared him a glance. "Not here." The streets outside were lined with aging buildings, cracked sidewalks, and small shops that had seen better days. They had taken a detour through one of Chicago's less affluent areas, avoiding a road closure near downtown. She rarely came to places like this anymore. The air here felt different, heavier with the weight of struggling businesses, lost dreams, and people simply trying to get by. Marcus scrolled through his phone. "There aren't any 5-star restaurants nearby, but there's a diner a few blocks away, Midtown Diner. Seems decent." Vivian arched a brow. "A diner?" Her tone was laced with disapproval. When was the last time she had stepped foot in a diner? Decades ago, perhaps, before she had built an empire. Before her world had been defined by fine dining, private chefs, and reservations made months in advance. "It's either that or waiting until we reach the hotel," Marcus pointed out. She exhaled sharply, glancing out the window once more. The thought of sitting in traffic for another half-hour was not appealing. "Fine," she said, adjusting the cuffs of her designer coat. "Let's get this over with." The car slowed to a stop outside Midtown Diner. The neon sign above the entrance flickered slightly, the red glow casting an uneven hue on the sidewalk. The windows were slightly fogged, and through them she could see the simple booths, a long counter lined with stools, and a handful of customers. Vivian stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement. The moment she pushed open the door, a small bell jingled, announcing her arrival. The scent of sizzling bacon, brewed coffee, and freshly baked bread filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the refined aromas of her world: truffle risottos, aged wines, gourmet seafood. She resisted the urge to wrinkle her nose. The patrons barely glanced at her. A few men in construction uniforms, a couple of students studying over plates of pancakes, an elderly woman sipping tea at the counter. They all belonged here. Vivian did not. She scanned the diner, choosing a booth in the farthest corner, the one with the most privacy. As she settled into the worn leather seat, she pulled out her phone, intending to distract herself. "Good evening, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" The voice was soft but steady, breaking into her thoughts. Vivian looked up, expecting to see an older waitress, someone with tired eyes and a well-worn apron. Instead, she found herself staring at a young woman, no older than 25, with deep brown eyes and dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hands lightly gripping a notepad. There was a faint weariness in her expression, but she carried herself with quiet confidence, moving with grace and efficiency. Vivian's initial instinct was to dismiss her, to order quickly and leave. But something about the girl's eyes made her hesitate. Something about her felt familiar. Vivian's fingers curled slightly against the tabletop. "Nonsense. Just coffee," she said finally, her tone cool but polite. The waitress nodded, "Coming right up." As she walked away, Vivian found herself frowning slightly. Why had she hesitated? It was just a waitress, just a random encounter, and yet something deep inside her whispered that this moment was important, that somehow she was meant to be here. But why? Here is the fully expanded Chapter 2, an unexpected accident in plain text so you can copy it easily. Vivian sat stiffly in the corner booth, glancing around the diner with barely concealed irritation. The cracked leather seat beneath her, the faint scent of grease lingering in the air, and the distant hum of conversation from the other patrons all reminded her of how out of place she felt. She had spent decades cultivating a world of luxury, refinement, and exclusivity, and now here she was, sitting in a grimy little diner, waiting for an overpriced cup of coffee she wasn't even sure she wanted. She exhaled sharply, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the table as she glanced at her watch. The sooner she could get out of here, the better. The bell at the entrance jingled softly as another customer walked in, but Vivian barely registered it. She was too focused on keeping herself detached, distant, untouched by this place. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Here you go, ma'am," the waitress said, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. Vivian barely acknowledged her, glancing up only briefly. The young woman, Sophie, according to her name tag, looked to be in her early 20s. She had dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, tired but kind eyes, and a uniform that had seen better days. She moved with quiet efficiency, but there was something about her demeanor, something familiar, that made Vivian pause. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Sophie's grip slipped. The steaming cup tilted forward, and before either of them could react, the scalding liquid tumbled out, splashing directly onto Vivian's handbag. Gasps came from a nearby table. Sophie's eyes widened in horror, her body stiffening as she saw what she had done. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she gasped. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees, grabbing napkins and desperately trying to blot the dark stain from the expensive leather. Vivian's body went rigid. Her jaw clenched, her hands fisting against the table as a slow wave of fury rose within her. You have any idea how much that bag costs? She snapped, pulling the now stained handbag away from Sophie's frantic hands. Sophie looked up, eyes wide, face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't mean to. I'm really sorry, she stammered, her voice small but filled with panic. Of course you didn't mean to, Vivian said sharply, lifting the bag and examining the damage with a look of undisguised disdain. But that doesn't change the fact that you just ruined a bag worth more than you'll make in a year. Sophie swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Her shoulders hunched slightly as if expecting a worse reaction, a harsher punishment. Vivian had always been sharp-tongued. She had built her empire by being unyielding, unapologetic, and brutally efficient. And yet, something in the young woman's expression gave her pause. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was something else, something deeper. A painful familiarity. Vivian inhaled sharply, pushing down the strange feeling creeping into her chest. She didn't have time for this. Just, get me some napkins. And a manager, she ordered, her voice clipped. She reached into her purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked the damage. That was when she saw it. A thin, delicate gold chain around Sophie's neck. A small pendant glinting softly under the fluorescent diner lights. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. A locket. Her vision tunneled. The sound of the diner faded into the background. She knew that locket. She knew it because she had given it to Emily on her 5th birthday. Her pulse pounded in her ears. It couldn't be, it wasn't possible, and yet her grip on the handbag loosened as her focus shifted entirely to the pendant resting just below Sophie's collarbone. The delicate floral engravings, the faint shine of the gold chain. This was Emily's locket. A memory surfaced, a snapshot in time. Emily, twirling in her pink dress, her tiny hands clutching the locket against her chest. I'll never take it off, Mommy, I promise. Vivian's heart lurched. Was it truly her? Could this girl, this waitress, be Emily? Sophie, oblivious to the storm of emotions now raging inside Vivian, quickly rose to her feet. I'll get you those napkins, she said hurriedly, turning toward the counter. But before she could take a step, Vivian's voice, now quiet, almost shaking, stopped her. Wait. Sophie hesitated, looking back at her, puzzled. Vivian stared at her, her gaze locked onto the locket. Where did you get that? Her voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity of it sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. Sophie blinked, instinctively touching the pendant. This? Oh, I've had it forever, she said, frowning slightly. I don't really remember where it came from. My birth mother, gave it to me when I was little. It's the only thing I have from her. Vivian felt her throat tighten. Her fingers curled against the stained fabric of her bag. She had spent 2 decades searching for Emily. Countless false leads, sleepless nights, shattered hopes. And now, here in this insignificant diner, she had stumbled upon the one thing she had never stopped looking for. A part of her wanted to demand answers, to push further, to prove that this was real. But another part of her was terrified. Terrified that she was wrong. That this was just another cruel trick of fate. Still, she couldn't let this moment slip away. Her grip on reality felt tenuous at best as she repeated, her voice almost pleading now, "Who gave it to you? Do you remember? Please, try to remember." Sophie looked at her, confused, her brows knitting together. Why does it matter? Vivian's world had just tilted on its axis. And for the first time in 20 years, she felt something she had not dared to feel in a long time. Hope. The diner, the spilled coffee, the ruined handbag, all of it faded into the background. Vivian could see only that locket and the young woman wearing it. The possibilities swarmed in her mind. If this truly was Emily, then where had she been? Had she suffered? Had she been loved? Sophie, meanwhile, was growing uncomfortable under Vivian's intense scrutiny. Look, lady, I don't know why you care so much about this necklace, but it's just a locket. I've had it my whole life, and it doesn't mean anything special. Vivian inhaled sharply, gathering herself. It means something to me, she said carefully. Would you let me see it? Just for a moment, Sophie hesitated, unsure whether to indulge this strange woman's request. But something in Vivian's voice, the barely contained emotion, the urgency, made her nod. She reached behind her neck, unclasped the chain, and placed the locket in Vivian's outstretched hand. Vivian's fingers trembled as she turned the locket over. Her breath hitched. She pressed a small button on the side and the locket clicked open. Inside was a faded photograph. A woman holding a little girl. A woman who looked exactly like Vivian 20 years ago. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes. It was Emily. It had to be. Here is the fully expanded Chapter 3, a clue from the past in plain text so you can easily copy it. Vivian's anger immediately faded, dissolving into something far more unsettling: shock. Her breath hitched as she stared at the delicate gold locket resting just below Sophie's collarbone. The intricate floral engravings, the fine craftsmanship, and the way it shimmered under the diner's dim lighting. It was unmistakable. Her heart pounded violently, the weight of 2 decades of grief and longing pressing down on her all at once. It felt surreal, impossible. But there it was, dangling from Sophie's neck, the exact same locket she had given Emily on her 5th birthday. A fragile hope stirred within her. Could it really be her? Vivian swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain composed. Her voice, moments ago sharp with irritation, now softened into something almost unrecognizable. "That's a beautiful locket," she murmured, her eyes locked onto it. "Where did you get it?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers instinctively reaching up to grasp the pendant as if seeking comfort. A shadow of confusion flickered across her face. "It was a gift from my birth mother, but I don't remember her," she admitted, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "It's the only thing I have left from her." Vivian felt a tremor run through her hands. The confirmation was like a jolt to her system. Her birth mother. The only thing left from her. The words echoed in her mind, intertwining with memories she had tried so hard to suppress. Vivian reached into her purse with shaking hands, her fingers fumbling as she pulled out a worn, slightly faded photograph from her wallet. The edges were creased, a sign of years spent tucked away, removed and examined far too many times. She placed the photo gently on the table between them and slid it toward Sophie. "Look at this," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you recognize it?" Sophie hesitated before reaching out, picking up the photograph with delicate fingers. As she studied it, her brows furrowed, her eyes widening as recognition dawned. A little girl with dark curls, bright brown eyes, and a wide, innocent smile stared back at her. She was clutching a locket, the exact same one that now rested against Sophie's skin. This looks like me," Sophie whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. She lifted her gaze, searching Vivian's face for an explanation. "How is this possible?" Vivian's pulse quickened, her body frozen in a state of shock. "Because it is you," she whispered, barely able to contain the flood of emotions surging through her. Sophie shook her head, confusion evident in her features. "No, that's impossible. I grew up in foster care. My real parents, they never came for me." Vivian's eyes burned, moisture collecting at the edges. "I never stopped looking for you," she said, her voice cracking. "You were taken from me. I did everything, tried everything, but I never found a trace. Until now." Sophie glanced down at the photo again, studying it more closely. The little girl in the picture had her eyes. The same bright brown, the same shape, and that locket, it was exactly like hers. Not similar. "The same. What does this mean?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying that you're my mother?" Vivian inhaled sharply, feeling as though her world had just shifted. "Yes," she said, a single word that carried the weight of 20 years. "I am." Sophie's breath hitched. She leaned back, running a shaky hand through her hair, her mind racing with emotions she couldn't yet process. "I don't know what to think right now. This is too much." Vivian reached across the table, but she hesitated, afraid to scare Sophie away. I know this is overwhelming, but please just let me explain. Sophie's fingers instinctively clutched the locket, her breathing uneven. How do you know for sure? I mean, what if this is just a coincidence? Her voice wavered, uncertain yet filled with a desperate longing. Vivian wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Because I remember everything about you. The way you used to hum when you played with your dolls. The way you always had to have your nightlight on because you were afraid of the dark. Your favorite bedtime story, The Velveteen Rabbit. Sophie's head snapped up, her lips parting slightly. I still have a copy of that book, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I don't remember why, it's just always been with me. Vivian gave her a tearful smile. Because it was your favorite. I used to read it to you every night before you went to sleep. Sophie looked down at the photo again, her grip tightening around it. Her world felt like it was unraveling, and yet something about this woman, about Vivian, felt familiar, like a long-forgotten melody she had once known. If this is true, why now? Why did it take so long? Vivian's face contorted with pain. Because I had no answers. I searched, Sophie. I never stopped searching. Whoever took you, they left no trace. But I promise you, I would have done anything to find you sooner. Silence stretched between them. Sophie could hear the soft hum of the diner around her, the clinking of silverware against plates, the murmur of conversation. And yet it all felt distant, as if she were in another world entirely. I don't know how to process this, Sophie admitted, her voice trembling. It feels surreal. Vivian nodded, understanding the storm of emotions raging inside her daughter. I won't rush you, I won't push you, but please just give me a chance to show you the truth. To show you that I never stopped loving you. Sophie hesitated, a war waging within her. But then she looked back at the photograph, at the little girl she had never fully remembered, and something deep inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this woman was telling the truth. She took a deep, shaky breath. Okay, she whispered, tell me everything. Vivian reached out, finally allowing herself to take Sophie's hand in her own. I will, I promise. Here is the fully expanded Chapter 4, the truth revealed in plain text so you can easily copy it. Vivian's voice trembled as she spoke, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Emily, you are my daughter. The words left her lips, and she felt a wave of emotion crash over her, an aching mixture of desperation and relief. She had waited for this moment for 20 years, and yet it felt unreal, as if speaking the truth aloud might cause it to shatter like fragile glass. Sophie recoiled, shaking her head in shock. No, that's impossible, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. My name is Sophie. I don't have a family. She clutched the locket around her neck, as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Vivian's tears spilled freely now. She reached out, trying to take Sophie's hands, but the young woman instinctively pulled away. You weren't abandoned, sweetheart. You were stolen from me. I never stopped searching for you. Never. Her voice cracked with the weight of her grief. I thought I had lost you forever. Sophie's breathing grew uneven. Her mind whirled with confusion. How could this woman, this billionaire she had never met before, claim to be her mother? It didn't make sense. And yet something deep within her stirred at the words. Vivian continued, her voice laced with sorrow. I spent years searching for you, hiring private investigators, putting out rewards, praying that one day you'd come back to me. I never gave up, not even when people told me to move on. She paused, her lips trembling before she finally said the words that had haunted her for years. And your father, he didn't survive it. Sophie looked up at her, something in Vivian's voice striking a chord deep inside her. What about him? Vivian closed her eyes, the pain as raw as the day she had lost her daughter. He died a few years after you were taken. He blamed himself for losing you. The grief ate him alive, Sophie. He loved you more than anything, and when he couldn't find you, it broke him. Sophie felt her chest tighten. Her father had died mourning her. The thought felt like a knife slicing through her heart. She took a shaky breath, trying to fight back the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't remember any of this," she admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "I don't remember you. I don't remember my father. I don't remember being taken." Vivian wiped her tears away quickly, composing herself. "That's not your fault. You were so young when they took you. I was afraid you wouldn't remember. But don't you ever feel like something has been missing? Like there's a part of you that never quite fit?" Sophie's mind flashed to the dreams she had had since she was a child. Vague memories of a warm voice singing lullabies, the scent of roses in the air, a garden bathed in golden light. She had always assumed they were just figments of her imagination, fragments of a childhood she had never truly known. Her fingers absently brushed the locket hanging around her neck. "I've had this for as long as I can remember," she whispered. "I never knew where it came from, just that it felt important." Vivian nodded, a trembling smile forming on her lips. "Because it is important. I gave it to you on your 5th birthday. You said you'd never take it off, and you didn't. Even after all these years, you still have it. Doesn't that mean something?" Sophie looked at Vivian, truly looked at her for the first time. The woman's eyes, filled with longing, with love, stirred something deep inside her. A part of her wanted to believe. A part of her wanted to say yes, to collapse into this woman's arms and finally feel like she belonged somewhere. But doubt still lingered, heavy and unshakable. I don't know what to believe." Vivian reached for Sophie's hand again, this time moving slowly, giving her the chance to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Their fingers met and Vivian held on tightly as if she were afraid Sophie would disappear all over again. "I shouldn't have yelled at you earlier. I shouldn't have been angry. I was just so overwhelmed," Vivian whispered. "I am so sorry." Sophie's eyes softened, her walls beginning to crack. "You really think I'm your daughter, that after all these years we've found each other again?" Vivian's lips trembled and she squeezed Sophie's hand. "I don't just think it, I know it. I've spent my entire life waiting for this moment, and now that you're here, I will never let you go again." Tears slipped down Sophie's cheeks, her heart warring with her mind. Everything inside her screamed that this was impossible. But at the same time, it felt right. And maybe, just maybe, it was true. Vivian sat in silence, watching Sophie, her daughter, grapple with the overwhelming truth. The young woman had barely spoken since their revelation, her fingers occasionally brushing against the locket around her neck as if it held the answers she needed. Finally, Vivian took a deep breath and spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Come with me, Sophie. Let me show you the life you were meant to have. Let me show you the proof." Sophie hesitated, uncertainty clouding her expression. I don't know," she admitted. "This is all too much. I don't know if I can just walk away from everything I know." Vivian nodded, understanding the weight of the decision before her. "I don't expect you to believe everything right away, but I can give you something no one else can, the truth. Just give me a chance." Sophie exhaled deeply. She wasn't sure what she was more afraid of, that Vivian was right or that she was wrong. But despite her doubts, a small part of her longed for answers. Not for the wealth, not for the luxury, but because she needed to know. After a long pause, she whispered, "Okay, I'll come with you." Vivian's eyes welled with tears, but she held them back. She simply reached out, grasping Sophie's hand in hers, and together they stepped out of the diner. The car ride was silent. Sophie stared out the window, watching the city blur past her. The streets she had known all her life felt suddenly foreign, as if she were on the precipice of something that would change her forever. When they arrived at the grand estate, Sophie inhaled sharply. The mansion was unlike anything she had ever seen, elegant and sprawling with lush gardens, towering pillars, and marble steps leading up to an ornate entrance. Vivian turned to her with a soft smile. "This was supposed to be your home," she said. "Come inside." Hesitantly, Sophie stepped through the massive doors and into a world that was both unfamiliar and strangely inviting. The walls were lined with portraits, each face bearing a resemblance she could no longer deny. And then, Vivian led her to a grand study, where an old, worn photo album sat on the table. "I want to show you something," Vivian said, flipping open the first page. Sophie peered down and her breath caught in her throat. There she was, a little girl with curly dark hair and bright eyes, beaming as she sat on her father's shoulders. Another photo showed her as a toddler, clutching a stuffed rabbit with an unmistakable grip of comfort. More pictures followed. Birthdays, holidays, moments frozen in time. Vivian pointed to one with a trembling finger. "This was your first Christmas," she murmured. "And this was your favorite toy. You wouldn't go anywhere without it." Sophie swallowed hard, memories stirring in the back of her mind. She had dreamed of this before. She had flashes of laughter, the scent of roses, the warmth of arms that once held her. Could it be possible that those weren't just dreams? She turned the page, her fingers brushing over another image, one of Vivian holding her as a baby, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The woman in the photo was younger, but the love in her eyes was unmistakable. Vivian looked up at Sophie, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lost you, but I never stopped loving you." Sophie closed the album, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She looked up at Vivian, at this woman who had spent 20 years searching for her, and saw not a billionaire, not a stranger, but someone who had never stopped waiting for her. That night, as they sat by the mansion's grand fountain, the stars shimmering in the reflection of the water, Sophie finally found the courage to speak the words she had been holding in. She turned to Vivian, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom." Vivian's breath hitched. The word, so simple yet so powerful, shattered whatever walls were left. Tears fell freely as she turned to face her daughter, reaching out with trembling hands. "I will never let you go again," she vowed, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. And for the first time in 20 years, Sophie didn't pull away. The story ends not with the past that was lost, but with the future that lay ahead. Time may have stolen years from them, but love, unbreakable, unwavering love, had finally brought them back together. Sophie took a deep breath and gazed at the woman beside her. She had spent years feeling as if she belonged nowhere, wandering through life with no sense of connection to anything or anyone. And now, here she was, sitting beside her real mother, knowing that she had always been loved, always been wanted. Vivian ran her fingers gently through Sophie's hair, as if trying to make up for all the lost years in a single gesture. "You have a home now, my love," she whispered. "And you will never have to feel alone again." Sophie exhaled, letting the words settle into her heart. Maybe she would need time to fully adjust, to truly embrace this new reality. But for now, she allowed herself to lean into her mother's warmth, letting the years of pain and uncertainty finally begin to fade. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.